Kada Britain. Born on April 22, 1994, Kada Rose Britain was remembered by her loved ones as a bright, athletic teenager with a promising future. A member of the Round Valley Indian tribes of the Round Valley Reservation, she grew up in Covina, California. Kada was a high-achieving student and the star player on her high school basketball team. Friends and classmates described her as popular, confident, and quick-witted, and many believed she would leave her small town behind to pursue college and greater opportunities. Unfortunately, that future was stolen from her in the early months of 2018. On the night of February 7, 2018, Kada was last seen alive. 3 days passed before her family reported her missing, not out of indifference, but because Kada had been living a more unpredictable lifestyle in recent years. After graduating high school in 2012, she had planned to attend community college, but instead began associating with the wrong crowd. It wasn't long before she'd become abusing drugs. Her community was known to be suffering from both drug and alcohol issues. Through her substance abuse, Kada got to know a man named Niji Tony Fallais who was around 14 years her senior. Although she didn't know it right away, Fallais was bad news. He'd had far more than his fair share of brushes with the law and had been charged with numerous offenses ranging from manufacturing meth to endangering the health of a child to domestic violence. Fallais had previously lost custody of his children due to keeping them in filthy, squalid conditions. Despite a stint in prison in San Joaquin County, it appeared he fathered more children afterward. When he met Kada, she found herself caring for his kids, doing their laundry, cooking meals, and picking them up from school. While those close to her were deeply concerned about her relationship with him, their warnings went unheeded. On January 30, 2018, a bruised, bleeding, and visibly distraught Kada arrived at the home of her father and stepmother. She recounted how Fallais had attacked her with his fists and then grabbed a hammer. The following day, with help from the tribe's domestic violence center, Kada filed a restraining order against him. She also received financial support to replace belongings she had left behind, including her clothes and phone. However, Fallais ultimately convinced or coerced her into dropping the charges. Given his extensive criminal record, a conviction would likely have resulted in a lengthy prison sentence. However, that was not the end. After Kada was reported missing on February 10, 2018, a witness came forward to police with the horrific story. On the night of her disappearance, Kada was known to have been visiting a friend in the 23,000 block of Airport Road. The witness claimed that around midnight, Fallais, accompanied by his new girlfriend, a woman named Antonia, turned up at the house in a black Mercedes. Armed with a small pistol, Fallais went to the door of the house and demanded that Kada come out and speak with him. After this, a physical altercation ensued and Fallais began to chase his ex-girlfriend around the car, which was being driven by Antonia. Fallais managed to hit Kada and shove her into the car, and the three drove off together. The 23-year-old was never seen since. 10 days later, in mid-February, Fallais was charged with multiple offenses in connection with the disappearance of Kada, including assault, kidnapping, first-degree burglary, threats to commit a crime resulting in death or great bodily injury, attempted murder, and for being a felon in possession of a firearm and ammunition. However, Fallais pleaded not guilty and refused to cooperate with detectives who were investigating the vanishing of his ex-girlfriend. Several months later, in June of 2018, the police were forced to drop most of the charges due to a lack of evidence. Fallais's bail was reduced, and he was released shortly afterwards, although he still faced the gun and ammunition possession charges. In August, Antonio was arrested for suspicion of harboring or concealing a wanted felon. A few months later, in October, Fallais pleaded no contest to the firearm charges while his girlfriend pleaded no contest to being an accessory to a felony. Fallais, who was 37 at the time, was sentenced to 4 years in prison, while Antonio was sentenced to 18 months in prison and 18 months under supervision. She was also ordered to have no further contact with her boyfriend and was forced to spend 6 months in an inpatient drug rehabilitation program. Both detectives and Kada's family believe that Fallais kills the 23-year-old on the night she was taken. The problem is they're unable to prove it without first finding her body. During the investigation, Authorities questioned and arrested many of Fallis' associates. They also set up an anonymous tip line, and missing persons posters were plastered all across the surrounding counties. Meanwhile, friends and family did their best to raise awareness for Khadija's case on social media, including setting up a Facebook group. In 2019, a pond in Mendocino County was drained when cadaver dogs indicated that something was buried there. However, no human remains were found. Lieutenant Shannon Barney of the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office, who was also a member of the reservation, said in a 2018 article that he believed somebody knew what happened and where Khadija was. But they were keeping quiet, telling the press Democrats, throughout the ages, tribal people have closed down among their own within their own little tribal system for protection. That's part of the culture. We know there are people who know more than they're telling us, but we have not been able to break through that tribalism. In February 2018, a $50 $0 reward was offered for information in Kada Britain's case. That amount was doubled in 2020 with support from the FBI, who continue to assist in the investigation. Khadija's family remains determined to uncover the truth. In March 2018, her father, Jerry, and one of her brothers ventured into the snowy terrain of the Mendocino National Forest after receiving a promising tip. When their SUV became stuck, they pressed on by foot, but the search yielded nothing. Jerry has personally investigated abandoned buildings and chicken coops, bringing a shovel to probe for shallow graves. Despite the apparent suspect in the case, Khadija's family has yet to see justice or closure. Her body has not been recovered, and without it are unlikely to bring formal charges against Fallis. The investigation remains open and active. If you have any information on the location of Khadija or her remains, you can contact the Mendocino Sheriff's Office tip line on 707-234-2100. Moving on to the next case. Covina Massacre. On Christmas Eve 2008, in the quiet suburb of Covina, California, a horrific mass killing took place during a family holiday celebration at 1129 East Knollcrest Drive. At around 11:30 p.m., 45-year-old Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, disguised in a Santa Claus costume, entered the home carrying a cart with 4 semi-automatic handguns and a large gift-wrapped package. The package concealed a homemade flamethrower. Upon arrival, Pardo was greeted by his excited 8-year-old niece, Katrina. In a shocking act of violence, he immediately shot her in the face. Chaos erupted as some guests tried to help Katrina while others fled. Pardo opened fire on the gathering, indiscriminately shooting at those inside. After emptying rounds from his weapons, he opened the wrapped present and used the flamethrower to douse the home in racing fuel before setting it ablaze. The fire the house rapidly. A 20-year-old woman survived by leaping from a second-story window, sustaining only minor injuries. Another victim, a 16-year-old girl, was shot in the back but survived the attack. The young girl who was shot in the face miraculously survived her critical injuries. But 9 others at the Christmas Eve gathering were not as fortunate. Investigators later theorized that some of the victims were executed at close range, with Bruce Pardo standing over them as he fired. One of the survivors managed to flee the burning home and seek help from a nearby neighbor, alerting authorities. The fire itself was intense, with flames reportedly reaching heights of 40 to 50 feet, requiring the efforts of nearly 80 firefighters to bring it under control due to the massive quantity and volatility of the accelerant used. The ferocity of the blaze meant that the victims' remains could not be recovered until the fire had been fully extinguished. As a result, authorities had to rely on dental and medical records to identify the deceased. Among those killed were Bruce's ex-wife, 43-year-old Sylvia Ortega Pardo, and her mother, 70-year-old Alicia Ortega, who suffered gunshot wounds to the abdomen. Bruce also shot and killed Sylvia's father, who died from multiple gunshot wounds. In addition to those killed by gunfire, 6 others lost their lives to the fire and smoke. Charles Ortega, 49. Sherry Lynn Ortega, 45. James Ortega, 51. Teresa Ortega, 52. Alicia Ortega Ortiz, 46. And Bruce's 17-year-old nephew, Michael Andre Ortiz, who was the youngest victim of the massacre. In addition to the 9 murder victims, 2 children lost one parent, and an estimated 13 children were tragically orphaned as a result of these heinous murders. After his reign of pain and chaos, Bruce calmly got out of his Santa suit and into his street clothes which he had packed ahead of time. He then got into his rental car, a Dodge Caliber, and drove to the house of his brother, who was not at home at the time, in Sylmar, California, about a 30-minute drive from the crime scene. It was in his brother's home that he made the cowardly decision to take his own life, and died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Because the cheap polyester fabric of the red and white Santa suit had partially melted adhering to his skin, the suit was never truly taken off, and remnants of the false holiday cheer would be found adhered to his skin long after death. His body was found with $17,000 and cash wrapped in a girdle attached to his leg. His rental car was parked 1 block away from his brother's home, and it had been seemingly booby-trapped so that anyone who attempted to Santa's suit or anything else in the car would perish in a fiery blaze courtesy of black powder, a temperamental explosive. Seeing the threat for what it was, the bomb squad was able to shoot an incendiary device into the Dodge Caliber which destroyed the imminent threat, but also destroyed precious evidence that may have answered some of the investigators' questions. The 4 semi-automatic handguns that he had brought with him to the Christmas party were found near Bruce's lifeless body, packed with at least 200 rounds of ammunition. While police initially thought that Bruce had plans to flee to Canada because of a ticket he had purchased from Air Canada in the days leading up to the attack, it was later discovered to be a domestic flight that would have taken him from LA to Moline, Illinois. It was discovered that Bruce had called an old friend of his from high school to tell him that he would be visiting in the next few days. He had previously visited this friend back in February, but as Bruce took the cowardly way out prior to the flight, we will never know if the supposed trip was a red herring or if his plan simply changed after his senseless killing of 9 people. Back at the residence of Bruce Pardo, officers found what they described as a virtual bomb factory. It contained, in addition to various explosive materials, as well as the empty high-octane fuel container, empty boxes of 5 semi-automatic handguns. It is unclear if the 5th handgun was ever recovered, and also had a Benelli M2 tactical shotgun. A prior student of John H. Francis Polytechnic High School in Sun Valley, Los Angeles, and a graduate of Cal State Northridge, the would-be killer had worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in La Canada, Flintridge. He had met his soon-to-be wife back in February 2004, 4 years prior to the massacre. After a less than 2-year-long courtship, the couple wed in February, but marital problems arose almost instantly. The marital issues described by those closest to the couple surrounded the issue of finances. Bruce refused to open a joint account with his new wife Sylvia, and expected her to pay all the expenses of her 3 children from a previous marriage all on her own without the help or support of her new husband. In February, less than 2 years after the couple had married and just 6 months before the tragic Christmas killings would occur, Los Angeles County Divorce Court ruled that Bruce needed to pay Sylvia $1,785 a month as spousal support. Bruce, to his dismay, was also made to pay a one-time payment of $10,000 to cover Sylvia's building a new life separate from him. The courts, using an algorithm which took into account Bruce's current income and previous tax returns, calculated the spousal support number objectively. But unsurprisingly to those who knew him, Bruce thought that this government-ordered aid to his wife was patently unfair and morally unjust. A month after the tragic massacre, Bruce Pardo was terminated from his job under circumstances that suggested fault on his part rather than a routine layoff. Although the specific reasons remain undisclosed, sources familiar with the family reported that Bruce had grown furious over having to pay spousal support to his ex-wife, Sylvia. He allegedly believed she was misusing the money, claiming she lived rent-free with her parents while indulging in luxuries such as a high-end vehicle, spa treatments, golf lessons, and repeated gambling trips to Las Vegas. All funded, he claimed, by the financial support he provided. With limited forensic leads, investigators quickly focused on Bruce and Sylvia's divorce, which had been finalized just a week prior to the killings, on December 18th. Those close to the couple also raised the possibility that Bruce had kept a significant secret from Sylvia, the existence of a child from a previous relationship. That child had reportedly suffered a severe injury in a swimming pool accident, though little is publicly known about the incident, including whether Bruce played any role in it. Earlier in July of that year, Bruce had been dismissed from his role as an electrical engineer at IKT Electronic and Radar Systems. Despite extensive investigation, no definitive motive emerged beyond the fractured divorce and personal grievances, leaving the horrific events carried out by Bruce, infamously dubbed the Santa Shooter, etched into memory, with many survivors and families still grappling with the trauma he left behind. Moving on to the next case. Julie Gonzalez. In February 2010, 21-year-old Julie Gonzalez lived in Dripping Springs, Texas. She was married to George de la Cruz, but they were estranged and in the process of getting a divorce. The couple had a 2-year-old daughter, Layla, whom they shared custody of. Julie was busy balancing her job as a pharmacy technician, her studies, and spending time with her daughter. Julie was described as a hardworking and kind-hearted person who fully embraced her role as a mother and worked to raise her daughter independently. In February, Julie was last seen by George, who said she came by to drop off their daughter. Julie's Aunt Dora expected to hear from her that day but never did. When Julie didn't respond to calls and texts, Dora began to worry. Julie's family, her aunt, mother Sandra, and sister Samantha, spoke to George, who claimed that Julie had told him she was going on a trip for a few days. However, the family found this explanation hard to believe, knowing Julie would never leave without informing someone and would never abandon her daughter. Julie's family emphasized that her daughter was her entire world, and they believed there was no way she would ever leave her behind. Julie was known to be reliable and in constant contact with her loved ones. By 11 p.m. that night, her aunt and mother filed a missing person report with the Austin, Texas police. The police, however, found no evidence suggesting Julie hadn't left voluntarily, noting that as an adult, she had the right to go wherever she chose. Julie's mother, an aunt, also pointed out that her new car was missing. The following day, in February, Julie's family and her new boyfriend, Aaron, began receiving text messages from her. Julie's sister believed the messages were from her, as they included her nickname, but Julie's aunt, mom, and Aaron were skeptical. Aaron had just received a message from Julie saying she was breaking up with him, which shocked her mother because Julie was deeply in love with him. Additionally, Julie, or someone using her phone, had posted messages on Facebook stating she was depressed and had left. My aunt went driving around South Austin and spotted Julie's new car in the parking lot of a Walgreens. Her aunt ran inside, looked all over the store for Julie, but she was nowhere to be found. Concerned about what she could find, Julie's aunt contacted Julie's mother. Together, they checked Julie's trunk but didn't find her. They did spot a paper bag in the back seat which had asthma medication inside for Julie's daughter. It wasn't like Julie to not give George such an important medication for their own daughter. Julie's family asked one of the employees inside Walgreens if Julie had been there. They showed him a picture and he said she looked familiar. They also asked him if he knew anything about the car outside. He said that a girl had entered the store, and she said she was having car issues. The police obtained the surveillance footage from Walgreens. There were several women that matched the description of Julie, but Julie herself had not entered the store. Julie's family then plastered the city with a billboard, posters, and handed out T-shirts with Julie's picture on them. The police looked at Julie's phone records and social media accounts. Her phone and social media had gone quiet. It hadn't been used since February, the day after she was last seen. George's mom, Victoria de la Cruz, made a frantic phone call to the police. She asked them to come to her house. Victoria called them because she had found a large hole in the storage shed of the home she shared with her son. Victoria told them that she started to dig, but then she got scared and decided it's best to call the police. When detectives arrived, Victoria was covered in dirt and was clearly shaken. The hole that she had contacted them about looked eerily like a grave. George told the police that the hole was an electrical trench. Investigators decided to dig anyway, but found no sign of Julie in the hole. The police obtained Julie's bank records. They found that on the day Julie was last seen, George had used her card at Walmart and Best Buy. George had purchased an Xbox Points card at Best Buy because he had an obsession with video games. His obsession was one of the reasons he and Julie got divorced. George would have rather stayed home all day to play video games than to work and earn money. Victoria gave the police permission to search the house. Inside, they found the purchases from both stores and a receipt from Best Buy. The police obtained the surveillance footage from both stores. They saw George with his daughter at both stores. Jim Cook, a wireless expert, examined George's phone to map out his movements on February. He also compared them to Julie's phone. Julie and George's phones both moved together, which proved that George had possession of her phone. George had also accessed his MySpace page and Julia's page from the same IP address. The police also looked at George's Xbox activity. George was known to play video games for around 12 to 15 hours a day. On March 26, he hadn't played for about 20 hours. The police believed George had done something to Julie, but they did not have much evidence to even prove that she was not alive anymore. Unfortunately, the case then went cold for some time. For 3 years, Julie's family waited for answers and had to share custody with George. Julie's mom asked George constantly if Julie was going to come back. George always told her she was going to someday. Finally, on February, George de la Cruz was arrested and charged with taking Julie Gonzalez's life. The prosecution offered George a reduced sentence of 50 years if he cooperated and told them where Julie's body was. George always denied being involved. He rejected the offer and decided to plead not guilty. George's trial began in February. George never showed remorse, but seemed nervous. The prosecution didn't have a body, but needed to convince the jury that Julie was never coming back. They said a knife, ammunition, and some clothing that appeared to have been burned was also found in the de la Cruz's backyard and shed. Yet, defense lawyer Robert McCabe and Keith Lauerman contended that prosecutors had left too many loose ends and too many unanswered questions. They attacked the state expert's analysis, raised questions about its witnesses, and said the timeline prosecutors had offered was impossible. George de la Cruz, who was described as an immature and irresponsible heavy video game player, would not have had the time or wherewithal to clean his home, dispose of his estranged wife's remains, and dig a hole in his backyard to bury her. All before he was captured on security camera footage with their daughter, McCabe said. Convictions are about knowledge, the attorney argued. You convict on fact, not fantasy. You convict on logic, not emotions. When you don't, he told jurors, innocent people end up in prison. On February, George de la Cruz was found guilty. He put his head down while Julie's family celebrated. In February, 27-year-old George was sentenced to life in prison. At present, he remains incarcerated at the Jim Ferguson Unit in unincorporated Madison County, Texas. He will be eligible for parole in the year February 1943. Julie's family said that they are praying that George will someday tell them where Julie is. They hope that he will let his daughter know what really happened to her mom. In February, the house belonging to Julie's mother, Sandra Sotu, burned down. Julie's family managed to escape safely after being alerted by their dog, but their house was destroyed and they lost everything. To support them, a benefit was held at Jack's Roadhouse in San Marcos. The event featured homemade barbecue and live music, and the family was deeply moved by the outpouring of support from strangers during such a difficult time. Julie's sister, Samantha Petrie, expressed her gratitude saying, "We have been through a lot. At first, when I got the news, I did think this was just one more thing being thrown at us. Today, it really shows that not only the love and support from our family and friends, but also from people who know the story of my sister, Julie Gonzalez, who have not forgotten about our family and our story." The Thompson family. In 1996, 40-year-old Everett Arthur Thompson was regarded as a philanthropic, devoted, and diligent spouse and parent. He was born in March 1956 to Herman and Earlene Thompson in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was the second oldest of 6 children. He was a gifted trombone player in the Hampton Institute School Band in high school and an athlete. After that, he relocated to Chicago, where he met Lydia White while working for a company that manufactured steel. After being married in 1982, the pair stayed in the Chicago region. Everett Jr., age 11, and Andrew, age 8, were their 2 children. In the end, Everett Sr. quit his work to follow his dreams of becoming a restaurant owner and opened Eat & Company on Chicago's Lawrence Avenue and 71st Street. The Eat represented his name. The family was well established in their residence in the 8100 block of South Rhodes Avenue, and their peaceful, friendly demeanor was well known to the neighbors. They also tended to keep to themselves. However, things changed when Lydia's brother Kenneth moved in with them in February 1996. He had just served a sentence for sexual assault and was out of prison. It was known that he had a lengthy criminal past, including 2 burglary convictions and 4 sexual assault convictions. Living with her father, convictions, and 4 sexual assault convictions. Living with her father was not ideal, but Lydia did have a place to call home. The property had been bequeathed equally to Lydia, her brother, and Phyllis, the pair's New Mexico residing sister. She was therefore unable to just throw Kenneth out of the house. Kenneth was by all accounts unwelcome by the Thompson family, a belligerent and abrasive man who had only caused trouble since arriving. Everett's brother-in-law was characterized by his family as a freeloading house guest. Lydia dialed 911 on +1996 after Kenneth had threatened to kill her with an axe. Lieutenant Robert Harsheimer of the Chicago Police Department stated that when law enforcement officials reached the area to defuse the situation, they discovered it was peaceful and quiet. According to Harsheimer, there was no continuous issue, nothing very noteworthy. The quiet prevented the police from making any arrests. Then, on July 5th, 2 days later, Herman Thompson contacted his son when he was at the restaurant. The two spoke briefly before Lydia called Everett. She desperately pleaded with her husband to return home, saying that she had locked herself in the bedroom and that Kenneth had followed her throughout the house with an axe. In order to go home, Everett quickly told his father about the phone call and hung up. It was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when one of his staff members noticed him leave the restaurant. Everett and the other Thompson family members were never seen again after that. 2 hours later, Kenneth came into the restaurant to inform a manager that Everett had been taken into custody after a vehicle accident. Without providing any further details, he departed once more and got into Everett's van. Just before Kenneth left, the manager saw that his white trainers had crimson streaks on them. After not hearing from the family since July 5th, 12 days later on July 17th, Everett's parents, who were still living in Philadelphia, requested that the Chicago police do a welfare check on them. Officers searched the family's residence but were unable to locate the Thompsons. Kenneth was the one who responded. The family had moved to Philadelphia, he informed the cops. It's puzzling that detectives didn't probe this further, given that Everett's parents, who live in Philadelphia, were the ones who first got in touch with them. Officers didn't look into it further because they believed the Thompsons had taken the family vehicle on their trip because it was also missing. They believed that there was no proof of foul play at this time. Kenneth provided several different versions of the family's whereabouts throughout the course of the following few weeks. He mentioned that they had traveled to Philadelphia by bus, that they had traveled by bus to Minneapolis, or that they had traveled to Hawaii. Even though he didn't bother to verify his account, law enforcement did not intervene. Kenneth was ultimately taken into custody while operating the Thompson family van. Because he had forged Lydia's signature on a check, he was caught. Officers failed to draw the connection between Kenneth's driving the van and his prior assertion that family members had used the vehicle to travel to Philadelphia. He was therefore never questioned again at this time, and the van was never examined or searched. Everett's parents, fed up with the police's lack of interest in the matter, traveled to Chicago in search of clarification. They looked into the disappearance on their own and talked to Eat & Company staff members, but they were unable to uncover any fresh information. When they were unable to find anything useful, they went back to the police and asked them to look into the matter. At that point, the manager of the restaurant where Kenneth had spoken on July 5th disclosed their brief conversation to the police. However, Everett's arrest or involvement in an accident that day were not documented by the detectives. After investigating the case further, police found that Kenneth had faked the signatures of both of his sisters in order to sell their father's property after the Thompsons vanished. A state inspector who had seen the house just before it was sold noted that the kitchen floor had been totally torn out and that one bathroom, bathtub, and toilet had been painted crimson. Officers who had reacted to Lydia's 911 call on July 3rd had inspected the property at the time and noted the kitchen floor was intact and there were no red bathroom fixtures, leading them to assume that these changes had been made after the family vanished. But the new owners had already moved in and started destroying the house for remodeling when law enforcement discovered that it was illegal. Kenneth was interviewed multiple times throughout the course of the ensuing weeks and months, but the police never had sufficient family had disappeared. In July 1997, Kenneth's caravan was investigated by the FBI. They discovered a pair of men's tennis sneakers inside. One of the children's socks was under the crawl area. Test results indicated that the blood on both was human after it was dyed. Additionally, it was found that Kenneth had sold the van belonging to the Thompson family to a salvage yard and that the van had been compacted, erasing any possible evidence. November 1997, a few months later, saw Kenneth's arrest for not registering as a sex offender. After being freed, he was detained once more for bank fraud the next month. He had written a check for more than $13,000 under Lydia's name. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jacqueline Ross, the prosecution, stated that Kenneth had killed the Thompson family with an axe at the court hearing regarding his fraud charges. The surrounding circumstances offer compelling evidence. She added, the accused person killed his sister, her spouse, and their 2 kids. The government maintains that although bank fraud is the offense, the murders were committed in furtherance of that crime. The prosecution and investigators have proposed the notion that Lydia and Kenneth's father's property became available to them during Kenneth's prison sentence. His sister and her family had already moved in by the time he was freed. Kenneth made the decision to kill the family in order to obtain what he wanted, maybe because he was angry about having to share the house, or maybe he was just interested in the money he could make from selling it. Kenneth committed suicide on December 25, 1997 at 4 in the morning while confined to his jail cell in the Federal Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago using a bedsheet. He didn't leave any instructions or clues that could point detectives in the direction of the Thompson family's remains. Although the family was killed between July 5 and July 6, 1996, according to law enforcement, there was never enough evidence to prosecute Kenneth White. Regretfully, if authorities had taken action sooner, there may have been evidence. The investigation might have been hampered by the fact that it took 12 days before they were ever reported missing. There was no indication of human remains in either Kenneth's caravan or the family house. There is still no explanation for the Thompson family's disappearance. Moving on to the next case. Mateusz Kawecki. Mateusz Kawecki, originally from Czechów, a small hamlet in southeast Poland, had worked as a construction worker in Hanover, Germany for the previous 5 years of his life. He had been living with his father, who worked in the city as well, and had been in a long-distance relationship with his Polish fiancée before she became pregnant. On March 28, 2018, at approximately 11:30 p.m., Mateusz, 30, drove out in his 1998 BMW 525 with the goal of visiting his fiancée in Lipiagra, northwest Poland, as she was about to give birth. Mateusz was supposed to show up at his fiancée's house the next morning around 8 or 9 o'clock. There were about 402 miles of driving between Hanover and Lipiagra. Mateusz got a phone call from his father at 10:30 on March 29th. The 30-year-old explained that he had experienced heavy traffic and that a traffic accident had delayed him for 2 hours. He continued by saying that he was currently at the Polish-German border town of Zuskin and that he still had roughly 133 miles to travel. Mateusz texted his fiancée after he hung up to let her know he would be in for approximately 2 hours, but he never showed up at her house and was never heard from again. That evening, at about 5 o'clock in the evening, the 30-year-old's worried fiancée called his sister, who also lived in Hanover but couldn't get through to him. Mateusz's mother, who resided in Poland, then reported him missing to the police out of fear for his safety. However, the officer she spoke with advised her against it, saying they thought he would return shortly. However, the family was able to submit missing persons reports in Germany and Poland after a brief waiting period, and the inquiry got underway. German police dismissed the investigation right away, claiming that Polish detectives were in charge of it. However, this ultimately resulted in a slowdown of the investigation when Mateusz's family asked authorities to find his phone, only to be informed by Polish police that the 30-year-old's German SIM card prevented them from doing so. He vanished in Poland, according to German law enforcement, which further undermined their ability to complete this duty. Mateusz's father's account of his phone conversation with the 30-year-old was called into doubt shortly after detectives discovered that Mateusz's phone had never connected to a Polish network. This was finally explained, though, and it seems that Mateusz and his father did speak briefly over the phone on March 29th. Mateusz's family decided to start their own investigation into his disappearance because they were frustrated with the red tape that seemed to be impeding the probe. They conducted a street search, contacted nearby business owners for CCTV, and went around the community putting up the photo of their missing loved one and pleading with witnesses to come forward. Eventually, they turned up on TV, complaining about the police's lack of attention, communication, and advancement. Mateusz's family didn't know what had happened to him for 6 months. Then, on September 12th, his mother's neighbor came over to talk to her about her barn, noticing that there was a terrible stink coming from it. It was said that the odor has been present since July. Although Mateusz's mother couldn't find it, she thought it was a dead animal. The neighbor then volunteered to search for the monster by going up to the barn's attic area. She concurred. The neighbor discovered a stack of clothes and other stuff, including a rucksack, up in the attic. But when he looked more closely, he was shocked to see that he had discovered a body. He saw 2 nooses hanging from the roof when he looked up. The body had begun to decay quickly due to the summer's heat. Because of this, the head was separated from the body and was in such a bad condition that it was impossible to identify the corpse by sight alone. But Mateusz's backpack was positively confirmed as being on the floor. It was only logical for law enforcement to deduce that the body belonged to the 30-year-old who went missing. A later definitive identification of the cadaver as Mateusz was made. Authorities declared Mateusz's death to be a suicide shortly after the body was discovered and returned his possessions to his family. Interestingly, his fiancée's house was the other way around from his mother's. Mateusz's detached foot was discovered by his family 4 days later, still within his shoe, demonstrating how hurried and careless the investigation had been. It's also unclear why his missing foot wasn't mentioned during the autopsy. According to reports, it would have taken too much time for police authorities to check the barn extensively at the time the body was discovered. And further intriguing piece of evidence is that Mateusz's teeth were knocked out, and some of them were blood-stained on his clothes when he was discovered. There were also bloodstains on his clothes, and an orange juice box and a Polish water bottle filled with cigarette butts were inside his backpack. Mateusz, meanwhile, wasn't a fan of orange juice. His car keys were not found with his wallet, despite the fact that these goods were discharged without analysis. In the years since his passing, his car has never been located, and its registration has never been picked up. His phone, which had one call to his uncle on March 30th, was also discovered with the body. But since it terminated within a few seconds and didn't have time to connect, it's thought to have been an inadvertent call. The call never reached his uncle. According to one prosecutor, detectives discovered multiple Polish public transportation tickets that were dated after the day he was thought to have died. Mateusz's family stated that they utilized the barn all summer long and didn't detect the body, despite the fact that the attic was visible from the ground floor. Since Mateusz's body was discovered, his sister has charged the Polish police with being careless. Following their punishment for misconduct, 2 policemen have received no further discipline. German officials have also analyzed Mateusz's phone, looked through security CCTV footage, and investigated his Hanover apartments, where they found his tablet. Authorities discovered that Mateusz had lied to his family on March thanks to this evidence. He wasn't in his car, and wasn't even close to where he claimed to be when he told his father where he was. Clutched receipts from his backpack revealed he was in fact still in Germany at the time. The 30-year-old traveled by train to Frankfurt an der Oder, a German border town, on March 28th. From there, it is assumed that he walked to Sławice, a Polish town. It had been almost a day since he had informed his family that he was already in Poland. He and another individual checked into a motel in Sławice. It's unknown if this individual has been located and questioned. Mateusz took the train to Warsaw the next day and from there, the bus to Zamość, which was near his hamlet. He reached Zamość at midnight. However, it's unclear how he got back. Mateusz's automobile has still not been found as of 2021. He never deregistered the car or transferred ownership according to the records. Furthermore, toxicological testing has never been performed on his body, and it's still unknown when exactly he passed away. Even though investigators determined that Mateusz committed himself, there are still a lot of unanswered mysteries regarding his case. What was the reason for his tooth loss? His automobile is where? Why did two nooses exist? He didn't drink the orange juice. So why did he have a bottle of it? Why had he gone to the hotel and with whom? How in the world did his family miss his body in the attic? And why did they not look into the stench more thoroughly? We don't know if we will ever find the answers at this stage. Moving on to the next case. Mary Virginia Carpenter. Mary Virginia Carpenter, at 21 years old, boarded a train on June 1, 1948 and left her Texarkana, Texas, home to travel 6 hours to the city of Denton. Virginia had a black hatbox, a matching makeup case, and a brown steamer trunk with her. She met Marjorie Webster, a fellow Texarkana native, on the train while she was traveling to Texas State College for Women, or Texas Women's University, as it is now known. The two struck up a conversation as this was also Virginia's goal. Virginia had studied journalism at the University of Arkansas before deciding to switch to science studies in order to pursue her dream of working as a lab technician. She had initially registered at TSCW for the 1945 to 1946 academic year, but she had to leave to care for her ailing mother. Virginia was the only kid left to take care of her mother when her father passed away when she was only 15. However, one benefit of staying at home was that she was able to save more money for her studies. Virginia attended Texarkana Junior College for a period before deciding to enroll at TSCW for the summer term of 1948. In the fall, she intends to start her training as a lab technician. Virginia and Marjorie decided to ride together in the taxi to campus at the station. By the time they got there, though, the 21-year-old remembered she hadn't checked on her bags. So she asked Edgar Ray Jack Zachary, the cab driver, how much it would cost to travel back to the train station. When Marjorie asked Virginia whether she wanted to travel back with her, she replied, "No. I'll go alone. I'll be okay." Consequently, the two split off, with Virginia making her way back to the station. It was at this point that she realized her luggage was still missing. She was informed by a station worker that her trunk would not be arriving for a while, and so the taxi driver promised to come get it for her in the morning. Jack Zachary. Virginia consented to give him her station. It was when Virginia got at the university's Brackenridge Hall. It was about 9:30 p.m. Zachary, who was 20 years old, reportedly told the police that he got out of the taxi and went up to two men who were waiting outside a convertible car that was either yellow or cream in color. Zachary stated that one of the men was tall and the other was chubby, and the car was maybe a Pontiac. Virginia supposedly seemed to know them. "What are you doing here?" she asked them as she approached, as though it astonished her to find them there. Zachary departed as they started conversing. He picked up Virginia's steamer trunk and placed it on the building's front lawn the next morning. Although he maintained that she had instructed him to leave it there the previous evening, the university's Dean of Women pointed out that it was quite uncommon for a student's luggage to be left on the lawn as opposed to being delivered to their door. Before staff members ultimately took the trunk in, it was left out on the grass for 2 days. In the meantime, Kenny Branham, Virginia's boyfriend, called her mother to inform her that he hadn't spoken to the 21-year-old in 3 days. This was not like the usual. When her mother Hazel got in touch with the college, she found out that Virginia hadn't enrolled. She immediately started calling her friends and relatives to see if anyone had seen her. When they hadn't, Hazel filed a missing persons report, and the search got underway. When detectives followed Virginia's last known movements, they encountered Jack Zachary, a cab driver, who provided them with information regarding the vehicle's color, yellow or cream. A young man whose girlfriend was a TSCW student was identified as the owner of this vehicle. The two males were allegedly saw by the couple strolling about the car, but they were not observed conversing with Virginia. It was determined that neither the young man nor his girlfriend had anything to do with the 21-year-old's disappearance. A gas station attendant in the Texas city of Aubrey believed he saw Virginia in a yellow convertible 2 days after she vanished. A young woman and two men were with her. Then on June 11th, at a bus stop in DeQueen, Arkansas, a ticket agent noticed a young woman who looked like Virginia. She appeared anxious as she waited at the station, apparently chewing her lip and peering out the doors after getting off a bus from Texarkana. Afterwards, she departed with an older male who appeared to be in his mid-20s. The agent got a call shortly after this sighting from a woman inquiring as to whether Miss Virginia Carpenter was present. But all of this went unnoticed by the agent until the next day when she noticed in the local media that Virginia had vanished. After identifying the 21-year-old from a photo and calling the police right away, she later questioned whether or not she had accurately recognized the young woman. Additionally, at Cerro Negro, Texas, a woman who appeared to be Virginia was observed. Many more sightings of Virginia have been reported across the nation. Not one of them, not even the ones that were just named, has ever been verified. Investigators pondered whether Virginia had ran off with another lover, and a number of Virginia's previous partners conjectured that this was likely the case because they saw how readily she fell in love. Nonetheless, her family thought the 21-year-old wouldn't walk away silently. Prior to her disappearance, Virginia was engaged, but she ended the relationship a few weeks before the wedding. Kenny Branham, her boyfriend at the moment, cleared a polygraph exam. Law enforcement disqualified him from the probe due to this and his lack of motivation. A vast search was conducted for Virginia, looking into wooded areas, creeks, storm drains, and abandoned wells. Authorities used both boats and airplanes, but they were never able to locate any evidence of Virginia. Her handbag has never been found, and her trunk held no information on her whereabouts. Since they were unable to identify a motive for Virginia's escape, law enforcement did not think that she fled on her own. She didn't owe anyone money, had no criminal record, and no envious ex-boyfriends or lovers to flee with. Additionally, she was not pregnant based on the results of her most recent medical examination, which was conducted not long before she vanished. A 3-by-1 wooden box was discovered in a smokehouse close to an abandoned farmhouse on October 18, 1959, approximately 7.5 miles northeast of Jefferson, Texas. There were human remains within, in particular, a woman's skeletal remains. The teeth did not match those of the 21-year-old, despite the fact that it was established that the bones belonged to a Caucasian girl with a shorter leg, which Virginia had. Virginia's taxi driver on the day she vanished, Jack Zachary, is still being investigated as a possible suspect. He was known for being violent and physically abusive, and he had a history of minor infractions. In 1957, he was also accused of attempting to rape a woman, but the victim requested ultimately came out 10 years later and denied having given it to him. He acknowledged that he hadn't really been home until 2 or 3 in the morning, but she still maintained that he had been abusive to her and had made her make up an alibi. Zachary was never ruled out in connection with Virginia's case. Despite the fact that he was questioned multiple times and passed 2 polygraph exams, 1984 saw his death. He was not connected to the disappearance by any hard evidence. There is a theory that Virginia was the victim of the Texarkana Phantom Killer, the same person who killed 5 young people in Texarkana and its environs in 1946, largely in lovers' lanes during the Moonlight Killings. 3 of the victims knew Virginia, and the perpetrator has never been found or identified, but there's no proof that she ended up being one of the Phantom Killer's victims. A man came forward in 1998, telling authorities that he thought Virginia was killed and raped by 2 men soon after she vanished. He claimed that her body had been interred at a stock tank close to the university's campus in the dam. There were no remains or other pieces of evidence found when the dam was searched. By this point, both of the men who were identified as the culprits had passed away and were never made public. On June 1, 1948, at roughly 9:30 p.m., Mary Virginia Carpenter, then 21 years old, was last seen outside Brackenridge Hall at the Texas State College for Women in Denton. She is described as a 5'3", 120-pound white woman with brown hair and brown eyes. She limps from a past bone infection in her right hip and has an appendectomy scar on her abdomen. When May vanished, she was recuperating from a bad bout of sunburn, and she went by the moniker Jimmy. Her final known appearance was in a white dress with stripes of brown, red, and green with silver buttons running down the front. a white straw hat with a flipped-up brim and a feather at the back, red leather platform shoes with a high heel, and a gold watch. She had a crimson purse on her person as well. Virginia will be 94 years old if she survives. Marisol Gonzalez. Marisol Gonzalez, 17, was a resident of Cottonwood, Arizona. She excelled academically at Mingus Union High School, had a large social circle, and a loving, close-knit family. Before entering her junior year, in the summer of 1997, she started dating Cecilio Cruz, a neighbor and classmate. But Marisol ended things with Cecilio when she found out he was seeing someone else. She discovered she was expecting a child shortly after. At approximately 10 p.m. on March 24, 1997, Marisol, who was by this point fully pregnant, got a call. She put on a light jacket, sweatpants, and slippers before leaving her house. This would be her family's final sighting of her. Marisol was reported missing to the police the following morning after her family was unable to locate her in bed. A body would be discovered in an alleyway a block from her home at around 6 in the morning. One shot to the face had wounded her. A man who lived across the street from the alley found her dead. Since he didn't speak English well, he had his son phone the police. It was difficult for the police to gather statements from the possible witnesses during their investigation. Rumors circulated that Cecilio belonged to a gang and might be implicated in drug-related crimes. Investigators believe that Cruz's affiliation with the gang may have intimidated witnesses. During the preliminary investigation, there was also a rumor that Marisol had been slain by a rival gang in retaliation for Cecilio. Cecilio was said to have spread this rumor. Marisol was 9 months and 1 week along with a scheduled delivery date of her son the next day. So it didn't seem like she would have left her house at night without telling anybody where she was going for just anyone. According to police theories, she was there to meet Cecilio. Cecilio would refuse to admit to speaking with Marisol for the entire day when police would ask him again. He claimed that night he was sleeping at home. Cecilio was still a major suspect, but the investigation quickly came to a standstill because there were no fresh leads or possible witnesses. Then, in February 2014, the case was chosen for investigation by the Cold Justice Show, a TNT TV program that looks into unsolved homicides. In partnership with the Cold Justice team, Cottonwood police looked into more than 90 leads related to this case. Prospective witnesses who refrained from making statements in 1997 began to come forward. They spoke with a witness who gave them a possible timeline for Marisol's death. That alleyway was across the street from where she resided. According to reports, she heard a gunshot at around midnight and went outside to look around, but she saw nothing. She did not witness a car speeding off or leaving. This rules out the notion that Marisol was murdered by a member of a rival gang who was seeking revenge. It was really dark when she first saw Marisol's body. They also spoke with the sister of Marisol. She stated that she was on a long-distance call at around 10 o'clock that evening. She handed it to Marisol when she hung up the phone, and she made the decision to call her buddy. The last person to speak with her was this one. The acquaintance was found by the investigators, who then asked her about that particular day. She informed them that day that she was on the phone with Marisol when the latter answered a call from Cecilio, telling her to hang up and they would talk later. The fact that Cecilio had lied to the investigators about not spoken with Marisol that day was demonstrated by this statement. Cecilio was their main suspect, but there was never sufficient proof to bring charges against him. When investigators arrived at Cecilio's workplace to speak with him, he would not answer questions in the absence of a lawyer. Investigators also discovered that at the time of Marisol's death, Cecilio's other girlfriend was also expecting a child. Actually, Marisol had run across the other woman in the waiting area while attending a visit with her OB/GYN. Because Cecilio was just 17 years old at the time and couldn't handle the burden of financially supporting 2 families, the police argue that Cecilio killed Marisol. The district attorney's office in Cottonwood reviewed the police findings and decided to send the case to a grand jury in order to get a murder indictment against Cecilia Cruz. Cecilia Cruz faced charges of manslaughter and second-degree murder in February 2014. However, since February 2014, There have been several delays in the case as two teams of public defenders have withdrawn, citing moral disagreements. Cecilia Cruz's new trial is scheduled to start on January 8, 2020. Lawson family murders. On Christmas morning of 1929, a horrifying tragedy unfolded on a tobacco farm in Stokes County when Fanny Lawson and her 6 children were found murdered. Each had been shot or bludgeoned to death. The case took an even darker turn when the family's patriarch, Charlie Lawson, took his own life just as authorities arrived. While his suicide shocked the community, it paled in comparison to the gruesome and chilling scene awaiting investigators, a scene of violence and mystery that remained cloaked in secrecy for decades. It would take more than 60 years before the deeper truths behind the murders were revealed. Just days before the killings, Charlie Lawson made an unusual decision. He brought his entire family into town to have their portrait professionally taken. As a working-class man and the son of a sharecropper, this was a rare and extravagant gesture. He had recently managed to purchase a centuries-old farmhouse and land for growing tobacco, and though far from wealthy, he spent money on new outfits for his wife and 7 children to wear in the portrait. The photograph, showing the family arranged in 2 solemn rows, all wearing serious expressions, would become a haunting symbol of the tragedy to come. In the now infamous family portrait, 16-year-old Arthur Lawson stands in the back row alongside his older sister Marie, 17, and their parents, Charlie and Fanny. Fanny, looking grim, cradles the youngest child, 4-month-old Mary Lou. In the front row, the younger children, James, 4, Mabel, 7, Raymond, 2, and Carrie, 12, stare solemnly into the camera. No definitive reason has ever been established for why Charlie arranged the professional photograph, but within days, nearly everyone captured in the frame would be dead. On Christmas afternoon, Marie was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on a 2-layer cake meant for the family's holiday meal. Around that time, Carrie and Mabel set out to visit their aunt and uncle nearby. As they passed the tobacco barn on the property, Charlie, lying in wait with a shotgun, ambushed the girls, shooting them at close range before brutally bludgeoning them to ensure they were dead. He hid their bodies inside the barn. Returning home, Charlie found Fanny sitting on the porch and shot her. He then entered the house and shot Marie as she worked in the kitchen, while the family's 2 youngest boys, James and Raymond, ran to hide in terror. After hunting down his sons, he turned on the infant. Nobody survived. Investigators would find the remains of the 6 children and their mother, Fanny, arranged on the ground outside with their heads propped on rocks and their arms crossed over their chests. In a strange and unclear exception, the eldest son, Arthur, age 16, had been sent by his father on a specific errand the evening before the brutal and senseless killings, thus sparing his life. When Arthur returned home from his errand to find the terrifying scene, he alerted neighbors who began to gather. Being that it was 1929, the police were not able to be called as instantaneously, and so a small crowd of onlookers had gathered at the scene before first responders could. Charlie, whose whereabouts were unknown to the gathering crowd, then took his final shot, this time aimed at himself. His only remaining son, Arthur, and a police officer who was called to the scene found Charlie's body along with letters he had written, seemingly suicide notes, which although they are no longer able to be found, are said to have not made any explanation in terms of motive. Investigators noted that a tree that was nearby to the murderer's body had the markings of footprints around it, as if somebody had been pacing. The funeral, attended by many, was poignantly and powerfully morbid in its arrangement. White coffins of various sizes stood propped up on stands all lined up in a row. By the size of the coffin, it was evident which housed the youngest victims. Furthering the pain of loved ones still reeling with the death of Fanny and her 6 innocent children, Charlie's brother, Marion Lawson, seemingly a bit of a monster himself, opened the now-departed family's farm home on Brook Cove Road to tourists interested in the morbid crimes that had taken place there on Christmas Day. Horrifyingly enough, and in a tactless display of callousness, the killer's brother, Marion, chose to display the cake that the eldest daughter, Marie, had been making for Christmas Day. The 2-layer cake baked in the early morning of the holiday was, unbeknownst to Marie or her family, the last thing that she would make in her short life, which would span only 17 years. The cake was eventually covered beneath glass by the killer's greedy brother turned House of Horrors tour guide because onlookers were plucking the raisins from it to keep his souvenirs. This tourist attraction remained as a morbid remnant of simpler times for the Lawson family, but sources close to the family who had kept quiet for so long revealed that the family may have not been so happy as the rest of the world had thought prior to the atrocities. Although technically the murderer was already known, Charlie Lawson had all but admitted it by committing suicide in such a public way. The actual motive behind the killings was unclear and on the minds of many for decades to come. No more so than on the minds of Bruce Jones and Trudy Smith, a father-daughter investigation duo. In 1990, after years of painstaking investigation, they were set to publish a book on the murders when something extraordinary happened. Stella Lawson Bowles came forward after 61 years to tell a startling secret. She confessed that prior to the murders she had overheard a discussion between Stella's own mother, Jetty, and Fanny's sister-in-law as well as Fanny's aunt. In this conversation, Stella overheard that Fanny Lawson, the mother of 6 children at the time with her 7th born only 4 months prior to her death, had confided to relatives that she had been concerned about an incestuous relationship between her husband, Charlie, and her eldest child, Marie. Because we know that Stella's mother, Jetty, died in early 1928 and the Lawson family was murdered at the end of 1929. The fact that this conversation happened almost 2 years prior to the murders shows that this was a concern long held by Fanny, and not just an early inkling of concern. Further evidence to stipulate this disturbing fact was produced in a true crime book where a neighbor of the Lawsons claimed that he was aware of some serious problems going on within the family, but he refused to give more details. Another neighbor, Sam Hill, claimed that he was aware of the fact that Charlie had forced himself upon his eldest daughter. The neighbor alleges that when Marie told him of the pregnancy, he swore her to secrecy, saying that if this vow of silence were to be broken, quote, there would be some killing done. Then, in February 2006, right before the manuscript was set to be published, a close friend of Marie Lawson's, Ella May, finally revealed that, a few weeks before the massacre, Marie opened up and told her that she was pregnant, and that the father of the baby was her own father. Ella May recalls that while they were having a sleepover with each other, 17-year-old Marie confessed that both her mother and father were aware of this incestuous pregnancy. No evidence of pregnancy was apparent, but scientific progress at that time did not allow for pregnancy tests in the same way that we can test victims of crimes today, and so these dark and shameful secrets were not revealed until decades later. Some have tried to excuse Lawson's actions by pointing to a head injury he sustained just months before the murders, arguing it may have caused a dramatic shift in his behavior. However, a post-mortem examination of his brain at Johns Hopkins Hospital found no abnormalities to support this claim. The only widely accepted explanation for the brutal killings remains the alleged secret involving Charlie and his daughter Marie. His surviving son Arthur, who many believe was intentionally spared, went on to marry and have 4 children, but the shadow of tragedy followed him. He died in a car accident in 1945, leaving his children fatherless, much like he had once been. Charlie Lawson was laid to rest in the same burial plot as the wife and children he killed. The gravestone, large and commanding due to bearing the names of 7 victims, stands out starkly in the cemetery, a looming monument to a horrific family tragedy. Inscribed on it are the haunting words, "Not now, but in the coming years it will be a better land. We'll read the meaning of our tears and then sometime we'll understand." Moving on to the next case. Connor and Sheila Dwire. The mysterious disappearance of married couple Connor and Sheila Dwire from County Cork in 1991 has left both investigators and the public puzzled for decades. Despite the passage of nearly 30 years, the case remains unsolved. At the time, the couple resided in Fermoy, County Cork. Connor, age 63, had worked as both a plumber and handyman before recently landing a job as a chauffeur for a wealthy German tourist, Fritz Wolf, who was vacationing in a nearby village. Reports suggest Connor thoroughly enjoyed this new role, particularly because it gave him the opportunity to drive luxurious vehicles he had long admired. In a modest neighborhood, the presence of a gleaming Rolls-Royce outside their home did not go unnoticed. It was conspicuous and drew attention. While Connor relished his new position, Sheila, aged 61, focused on maintaining their home. The couple's 2 adult children had already moved out, both relocating to England. Sheila kept herself occupied with daily routines such as cooking, running errands, and maintaining the home. Friends and neighbors often remarked on her polished appearance and noted that she always presented herself with care. There were no outward signs of trouble before the couple suddenly ceased all communication and disappeared without warning. Their last confirmed public appearance was at a funeral held at St. Patrick's Church in Fermoa on April 30, 1991, located only a short distance from their residence on Chapel Hill. They returned home afterward without incident. That same evening, Sheila had a phone conversation with one of her sisters. The precise timing of their disappearance remains uncertain. The final known contact with them occurred on May 1st, during another phone call with Sheila's sister, after which all further attempts to reach the couple went unanswered. Reports differ on the date they were officially reported missing, with some stating May 19th and others suggesting May 22nd. Either way, it's clear there is a gap of around 3 weeks in which the pair's movements are not accounted for. It's unclear why nobody reported the couple missing, not friends nor family, nor neighbors during that time. One of the Dwire's children, also named Connor, said he had last spoken to his parents on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th. He reported that nothing had seen amiss with the couple. The Dwires were finally reported missing when one of Sheila's sisters went to the home after failing to contact either half of the couple. She was met with a silent, empty house, and she alerted the local authorities. When the guard arrived on the scene, they immediately began to investigate. Nothing seemed out of place and nothing was missing. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry. The couple's personal belongings, including clothes and passports, were found in the home. A biscuit tin kept in the house still contained around $2,100. The only thing the guard couldn't locate was the couple themselves and their car, a white Toyota with the registration plate 5797ZT. In the years since their disappearance, no trace of the Dwires has ever been found. Their bank accounts have never been accessed and their car has never been located. Since the River Blackwater runs through the town, authorities conducted an exhaustive search of the water and the surrounding countryside, all to no avail. Shortly after their vanishing, Interpol was alerted and ferry records were combed through for any sign of either the couple's car or their presence on any of the ships. But once again, this lead was a dead end and no sign of the Dwires was found. Although there have been no confirmed sightings of the couple since 1991, several witnesses stepped forward in the years following their disappearance, claiming to have seen them alive and well. One local woman believed she had seen the pair in their car stopped at a set of traffic lights in Fermoy just shortly after the couple were thought to have vanished. There have also been different sightings in the cities of Dublin and Waterford. In 1993, the case was featured on an episode of Crime Call, the Irish equivalent to UK's Crime Watch program. After seeing the show, a woman reported seeing the couple at Lauders Airport in France in June of 1991. She said that the man appeared suspicious because he wore a long trench coat and kept a constant careful eye on his wife while he went to grab a newspaper. She thought it seemed like he was worried the woman would talk to somebody else while she sat and waited for his return. She said when the man returned to his wife, he said something to her and they both left. The witness claimed that the couple both had Irish accents. At the time, the witness was unaware that the couple had vanished, so she did not report the sighting right away. She later told authorities, during an interview that included one of Sheila's sisters, that the clothing she saw matched items missing from the couple's home, likely the outfits they were last seen wearing, as no other clothes were reported missing. Another notable sighting occurred in 1993, when someone claimed to have seen the couple at an airport in Munich. This account drew interest from investigators due to Connor's prior work with a German businessman. Despite this lead, the sighting could not be verified by either the Bavarian police or Interpol. An additional uncertainty in the case was whether Connor was still employed by Fritz Wolf at the time of the disappearance. or if he had stopped working, possibly due to Wolf's return to Germany. If he was still in Wolf's service, it raised the question of why his employer never reported his absence. In February of that year, a tip prompted law enforcement to search a lime quarry located about a 45-minute drive from Fermoy, but the investigation did not produce any new evidence. One of the most curious aspects of the case is that it is shrouded in rumor and hearsay. Reddit forum users have noticed their family's reluctance to discuss the case while accusations range from Connor orchestrating it is unclear where this rumor started, and it is unknown why he left or returned if the rumor is true. It's also been speculated that the couple took their own lives together in a suicide pact. This theory arose because Connor's brother mentioned that he had suffered from depression before. If Connor really did disappear in the prior decade, then perhaps his mental health struggles played a role in that too. One theory in the case postulates that the couple's vanishing is linked to the disappearance of William Billy Fennessy, who vanished from Fermoy almost exactly a year prior. William was of a similar age, and his car was also missing. However, his body and car were both pulled from the River Blackwater in February 2013. The most plausible theory suggests that the pair may have met a similar end as William Fennessy, though their car and remains have yet to be discovered. Their son, also named Connor, expressed his thoughts in a February 2008 interview, stating that his parents were well regarded and had known enemies. He described them as kind, respectful, and familiar faces within their community. Despite the passage of time, he maintained hope that they might still be alive but admitted that the uncertainty was tormenting, saying, "The not knowing keeps you awake at night. I wonder what the hell was going through their minds." He described the experience as deeply unsettling and surreal, calling it a living nightmare. In the years since their disappearance, few developments have emerged. No suspects have ever been publicly named, and law enforcement continues to emphasize that finding the couple's vehicle may be the key to solving the mystery. Until then, the disappearance of Sheila and Connor Dwire remains unsolved. If you have any information on the vanishing of the Dwires, you can contact the Fermoy's Garda on 02582100. Moving on to the next case. Denver Strangler. The Denver Strangler, also referred to as Jack the Strangler or the Strangler of Denver, was active between 1894 and 1903 and claimed only a few known victims. His targets were typically sex workers, and his identity has remained the subject of speculation for over a century. The first known victim was 37-year-old Lena Tapper, a French sex worker who had previously lived in Heron Lake, Minnesota before relocating to Denver. She was romantically involved with Richard DeMarty, and both were reportedly part of a secretive French group linked to underground human trafficking activities. On September 3, 1894, Lena was discovered strangled in her bed at her home on Market Street. Investigators at the time were unable to determine a motive for her murder. The second known victim was 23-year-old Marie Contessa, another French sex worker involved in the same clandestine organization, along with her partner Tony Sanders. Her body was found lying on her bed, having been strangled with a piece of cord pulled so tightly around her neck that it embedded into her skin. Marks from fingers were also visible on her throat. Marie was known to be relatively affluent, which led investigators to suspect robbery as the motive for her murder, especially since only 75 cents was found on her person. In the aftermath of her death, 5 individuals were taken into custody, including Richard DeMarty, the partner of the first victim, Lena Tapper. Reports indicated that DeMarty had previously shown romantic interest in Marie. However, all 5 suspects were eventually released due to insufficient evidence. Authorities found 2 of the men particularly suspicious. One of them, Antonio Santapietro, was a former police employee who had been dismissed from the force for reasons that were never disclosed. At the time of the murder, he was working as a messenger and was apparently favored by Marie over Emile Timmins, a cook who worked for her and was rumored to be jealous of Antonio. Both men were reportedly present in Marie's home around the time of her death, yet claimed they heard nothing out of the ordinary. Due to the lack of concrete evidence, neither was charged. The Strangler's final known victim was 24-year-old Kikuyo Hama, a Japanese immigrant who had first arrived in the United States during the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. While there, she met Ayamaya Hama, a cook, and the two began a relationship that eventually led them to relocate to Denver in 1893. A few days before Kiku's death, the police had raided the local prostitution business and arrested several of her associates. She secured their release while being aided by a French saloon keeper. But he later demanded money as a reward and the two got into a fight. It is unclear if this man was ever cleared of any involvement in her subsequent murder. Kiku was last seen alive on November 13th. She took a short walk with her friends before returning home and taking a nap with her curtains drawn. Ayamai then decided to go for a walk. When he returned, he found Kiku lying in her bed with a towel around her neck. She was still alive and gasping for air, and Ayamai pulled the towel off her before running across the street to yell for help from the other Japanese women who lived nearby. His shouts attracted the attention of a police officer who entered the room with them. By this time, Kiku was dead. There was clear evidence that a struggle had occurred as Kiku's bedsheets were disturbed and covered with blood. Additionally, a second damp towel was found lying on the washstand, and it was obvious that the perpetrator had been rifling through the 24-year-old's doors, likely looking for cash. The keys to both the front and back of the house were missing, and Kiku had finger marks near her windpipe as well as some bruising on her forehead. It was theorized that she had been thrown onto her back on the bed after the towel had been tied around her neck. Ayamai along with several Japanese women were arrested for the crime, but a lack of evidence led to their release. In the years following Kiku's death, 2 other women were murdered by strangulation and no one was ever charged with the crimes. It has been suggested the first victim was Julia Vaught, a 40-year-old psychic medium living on Compass Street. She had previously told investigators that she had been given a description of the strangler by spirits, who had reached out to her. On October 7, 1898, she was found dead in her apartment, a towel tied tightly around her neck. It's been suggested that the crime may have been committed by a copycat or someone attempting to divert attention from themselves. However, another theory posits that the Denver Strangler targeted Julia out of fear that she knew too much or could identify him. The next known victim was 20-year-old Mabel Brown, discovered in her Market Street residence in 1903. Her hands were bound with suspenders, a handkerchief was stuffed in her mouth, and marks on her neck indicated she had been strangled. Like the previous victims, Mabel was found lying on her bed. It's worth mentioning that alternative suspects existed in both cases. Julia's husband suspected a man named George Randall, an African-American who frequently borrowed money from her, but Randall was ultimately acquitted. In Mabel's case, she was reportedly romantically involved with 2 men, Harry Shallis and Samuel Holzweg, at the time of her death, though neither was ever formally charged. While several suspects emerged following the first 3 murders, none were successfully prosecuted. The first suspect was Richard Damity, Lena Tapper's boyfriend who worked as a landlord. Local rumors at the time claimed that he was a violent man, but the evidence pointing towards him was circumstantial at best. Despite this, he was considered the most promising strangler according to the Morning News. Prosecutors felt that they could get a successful conviction at least in Lena's case while detectives listened to the ravings of his sister who was imprisoned at the county hospital after allegedly going mad following her brother's arrest. She claimed to see the ghosts of the victims of the strangler. Eventually, Damity was charged with Lena's death. A total of 45 witnesses were brought in to testify and 2 of the alleged witnesses, a man and a woman, claimed to have seen Lena struggling with DeMarty through their window. Ultimately, however, a jury acquitted him and after the trial, he moved to Brazil. The second suspect in the case was a married French-Canadian man named Frank Rock. He was arrested because he matched the description of a man running from Kiku Aoyama's crime scene. Reportedly, he had even associated with the French underground human traffickers in the past. But eventually, Rock was dismissed when authorities failed to obtain a confession. Next, an Italian man named only as H. Meller was suspected of being the strangler when on November 8, 1894, he strangled a woman named Marie Vendress who was thankfully able to escape. He attempted to cut her throat with a razor but was thwarted by a police officer who arrived on the scene. The morning call reported that Police Chief Armstrong did not believe Mellor was the strangler, though, and so it appears he was never charged in connection with those murders. Victor Monciero was a 40-year-old French carpenter who came to the attention of police when a former friend of his, Alphonse Lemaire, drunkenly told a story about how he had committed the crimes. One day, Lemaire entered a saloon half-drunk, sat down and began listening to a conversation that Tony Sanders, the boyfriend of the second strangler Victor Murray, was having with a friend about the string of crimes. Lemaire then told Tony that the perpetrator was a man he knew. Upon being fed more alcohol, he expanded on this, revealing the name Victor Montero and claiming that the pair had met while serving time in San Quentin State Prison, California. He then said Montero arrived in Denver in 1893, 3 months before the crime spree began. Lemaire claimed Montero strangled all the women with the use of chloroform before robbing them. He reportedly even attempted to kill another woman named only as Xavier but failed, although Xavier did not report the incidents to the police. However, that's not where this story ends. When Victor Montero got wind of Alphonse Lemaire's story, he replied by claiming that Lemaire was the true strangler. At first, investigators were uncertain if either man was truly responsible, but they eventually leaned toward Lemaire as the likely suspect. Montero alleged that Lemaire was a transient sailor who had come to Denver from Salt Lake City, Utah, under his real name Charles Guichard. The two had met while incarcerated, and after their release, Montero traveled to Denver in search of work. Lemaire was later apprehended by Tony Sanders after sharing his story at a local saloon, and Montero was subsequently arrested as well. While in jail, Montero accused Lemaire of murdering women using towels and chloroform to rob them. Despite these serious allegations, either man was ultimately convicted of the crimes. Unlike many older unsolved cases, the Denver Strangler mystery involved a wide range of suspects, yet none provided definitive answers. More than a century later, the case remains unresolved, standing as one of the most chilling and enigmatic chapters in true crime history. Moving on to the next case. Baby boy Harry. A male baby's lifeless body was found wrapped in a blanket in a bag of Meadowbrook Drive on December 4, 2008 in Harry County, South Carolina. The baby was given the name Baby Boy Harry and buried at a Hillcrest Cemetery in Conway. There were no signs of the baby's identity or his biological parents. Investigators hoped that someone would come forward with information, but no one did, and the case went cold. His DNA was collected in February 2008, and in 2020 it was used to identify the mother of baby boy Harry. In March 2020, investigators confirmed that Jennifer Bastion from Pensacola, Florida, was the mother of baby boy Harry. In February 2008, at the time the infant's body was discovered, Jennifer had been a student at Coastal Carolina University. Rather than conducting an immediate on-site arrest, investigators chose to inform Jennifer over the phone that she would be taken into custody. Since there was no immediate danger to anyone's life and she had 2 young children, authorities wanted to avoid traumatizing them by arresting their mother in front of them. Jennifer then traveled to Myrtle Beach, where she was officially taken into custody. She was booked into the J. Reuben Long Detention Center in Conway on March 4, 2020. The baby's father was also identified, but he was not arrested, suggesting that he had no knowledge of the events surrounding the infant's death. Jennifer Bastion. Jennifer Bastion lived in Tacoma, Washington, and was preparing for a YMCA bicycle tour of Lopez Island. On August 4, 1986, shortly after 2 p.m., she set out on her bike toward Point Defiance Park with plans to return home afterward. Several people later reported seeing her in the park that afternoon. When she didn't return that evening, her family contacted the police. It wasn't until 28 days later that her body was discovered by a group of joggers near 5 Mile Drive. She had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators recovered DNA evidence near her body, which they believed belonged to the person responsible for her death. At one point, David Harold Fisher was considered a possible suspect. David had taken the life of Laura Lee Burbank in the Tacoma area in 1970 and received a 20-year prison sentence for the crime. However, on September 1, 1974, he escaped from prison. His absence wasn't discovered until the evening prisoner count. Investigators suspected he may have returned to the Tacoma and possibly encountered Jennifer. On December 6, 1989, Jennifer's case was highlighted on Unsolved Mysteries, generating a few leads that ultimately went nowhere. Then, on January 4, 1990, the program aired an episode about David Fisher. Remarkably, he watched the broadcast himself. The day after it aired, authorities arrested him in Alberta, Canada. He was not surprised. David had been living by the name Michael Raymond Porter and worked as a door-to-door salesman. An absolutely disturbing fact is that he performed magic shows in elementary and nursery schools. David was also married and had children. His new family knew nothing about his past. In January of 1990, David was taken back to the United States to continue serving his sentence after 15 years on the run. David was investigated for possible involvement in Jennifer Bastion's case, but investigators were able to rule him out as a suspect. Michelle A. Welsh is another girl whose life was taken in Tacoma, Washington, just a few months before Jennifer's. The two cases have always been linked. Investigators believe that the same man was responsible for ending her two girls' lives. In 2016, however, DNA testing proved that two different men were responsible. A composite sketch was then made for the suspect in Jennifer's case, a white male with blonde hair and blue eyes. On May 1038, 60-year-old Robert D. Washburn was arrested in Eureka, Illinois in connection of Jennifer's case. He had insert himself in investigation. Robert told investigators that he was in the park when Michelle had disappeared and Jennifer. He had been living less than 5 miles from Point Defiance Park, only a few miles from Jennifer's home. Investigators arrested him after his DNA matched the evidence found on Jennifer's body and clothing. In January 2019, he pleaded guilty and admitted to abducting Jennifer while she was riding her bike in the park. He dragged her into the woods, where he assaulted and strangled her. He received a sentence of 27 years in prison. For those interested, DNA testing also identified Gary Hartman in 2018 as the person responsible for taking Michelle's life. Moving on to the next case. Camila Lyman. Camila, later known as Kim Lyman, was born on September 4, 1932, in Westwood, Massachusetts, to Arthur T. Lyman and his wife. The Lymans were part of Boston's old money elite, having amassed significant wealth through the cotton industry, and Arthur himself had a long history of public service. Cam, who eventually began identifying as male, shared a strong bond with his father, particularly through their mutual passion for show dogs. Known for being self-reliant, Cam never married or dated, but was widely regarded as intelligent and highly skilled in his field. He devoted his life to breeding champion show dogs, especially favoring Clumber Spaniels and Bernese Mountain Dogs. Following his father's death from lung cancer in 1968 and his mother's passing in 1973, Cam became increasingly isolated and eccentric. Sometime after his mother's death, he relocated to Rhode Island, and by 1978 had begun living as a man, shortening his name from Camila to Cam. By 1985, Cam had transformed his appearance using steroids and a revamped wardrobe, adopting the stereotypical look of a man, complete with a mustache. Around this time, he formed a close relationship with George O'Neill, a dog handler he came to trust deeply. George took over the care of Cam's 40-acre estate and the nearly 60 dogs he lived with. He not only ensured they were fed and cared for but also represented them at shows. Yet, Cam's eccentricities extended beyond his isolation and minimal contact with family. He was known to carry a briefcase filled with expensive jewelry valued in the thousands and routinely brought large sums of cash, sometimes thousands of dollars, on simple shopping trips. In December 1987, Cam's family noticed something unusual. For the first time, they didn't receive a Christmas card from him. Concerned, they began to investigate and realized they hadn't heard from Cam in several months. More alarmingly, Checks made out to Cam were now being deposited into a Rhode Island bank account using a different endorsement rather than his signature. The family notified authorities of Cam's disappearance. They also contacted the law firm in charge of his trust, and a private investigator named Charles Allen was hired and sent to investigate the matter. Charles uncovered that Cam's caretaker and sole confidant George O'Neill had been depositing the 54-year-old's trust fund checks into his own accounts, and also that he held Cam's power of attorney and stood to inherit $2,500,000 from Cam's estate. Authorities questioned O'Neill in regards to Cam's disappearance and were told that earlier that summer, the pair had fought over the phone about the dogs and that O'Neill's employer had hung up on him. The next day, when O'Neill went over to the home, he found the phone ripped out of the wall and the doors wide open. O'Neill claimed that he believed Kim had gone to Europe to get sexual reassignment surgery. However, he could not provide any proof of this. He also couldn't explain why for 6 months he had failed to report Cam as a missing person. Not only this, but O'Neill then refused to allow law enforcement to search the property. He continued to show Cam's dogs as his own, and he somehow continued to keep cashing Cam's checks. Reportedly, much of Cam's cash had dwindled. Between $3 and $5 million of it was gone. Meanwhile, PI Charles Allen did not believe that Kim had gone for the operation because the 54-year-old man was afraid of going to the dentists and doctors. His sister Mary added that she didn't believe he would leave his faithful, beloved dogs behind. Cam was declared dead in absentia in 1995. Then in 1997, a decade after his disappearance, Cam's body was found in the septic tank of his property in Hopkinton, Rhode Island. The new owners of the house had found the remains when they noticed a strange smell emanating from the sewer. In 1998, the medical examiner confirmed that the remains were Cam's by using his dental records. It was determined that he'd been killed around the time that he went missing. In February 2003, George O'Neill was indicted for embezzling $15,000 from Cam's estates. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation and ordered to pay $450 in court costs. George O'Neill passed away in 2011 without ever revealing any further details about Cam's death. The Lyman family legally contested O'Neill's claim to Cam's estate, and ultimately he was awarded only the house, valued at $40,000, while the remainder of the estate was returned to the family. Many have long suspected O'Neill's involvement in Cam's disappearance, though others have speculated that a stranger, perhaps someone who knew Kim lived alone and carried large sums of cash and jewelry, may have attempted a robbery that turned deadly. Still, if that theory were true, it raises the question, why would the perpetrator go to the trouble of hiding the body? In June 1999, Cam's story was featured in an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which led to a surge of new tips. At the time, investigator Charles Allen stated that some of the leads could be a break in the case, though he did not disclose the details. Despite renewed interest and promising information, no one has ever been charged in connection with Cam Lyman's death. Harriet Buswell. Friends and acquaintances knew 27-year-old Harriet Buswell as a bright and charming young woman with one child. She was well remembered for her ability to focus entirely on the person she was speaking to, which allowed her to make friends fast. Despite her warmth and charm, Harriet's life was not without hardship. She battled to find consistent employment and make ends meet as a single mother of an 8-year-old. She frequently turned to prostitution as her main source of income to pay her rent and put food on the table. Harriet probably went to the Alhambra Theater on Christmas Eve of 1872 in an attempt to get some more cash to pay her expenses. She owed her childminder and her doctor, among other people. Harriet had dinner with an unknown man at the theater. They made a stop at a greengrocer on the way home to buy almonds, apples, and oranges. The landlady let them in when they got to the 27-year-old's boarding house on Couron Street. While Harriet stayed downstairs and had a drink with her landlady before joining her guest, the man went directly upstairs. The next day, Harriet stayed in her room all day. Her landlady went to check on her out of concern, but no one answered and the door was closed. The landlady, growing increasingly alarmed, had the door broken down, only to be confronted with a horrific scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. There in her bed, surrounded by blood-stained sheets, lay Harriet. She had 2 cuts on her throat, one to the left side of her windpipe and the other beneath her left ear. Her forehead bore a bloody fingerprint. The grisly nature of the crime overwhelmed the cops when they arrived on the scene, but they made every effort to get to work. It was said that despite the ferocity of her murder, the 27-year-old's face appeared calm. They also observed that her pajamas had not been tampered with. The fact that Harriet's door was locked from the outside and that no key was visible suggests that the burglar may have taken it with him when he fled. Still, there wasn't any blood close to the door. Witnesses claimed to have heard the man walk away at 6:30 that morning. The crime scene contained a number of tangible pieces of evidence. Near the sink was a bloody towel, suggesting that the murderer had cleaned his hands and possibly the murder weapon before making his getaway. There was an apple on the bedside table, and someone had taken one bite out of it. Nevertheless, Harriet's autopsy revealed that there was no evidence of the apple in her stomach due to the loss of the 27-year-old's pocketbook, some jewelry, and a porn ticket from her room. Authorities surmised that the motivation was robbery. After talking to witnesses, detectives gradually put together a profile of the suspect. The man Harriet had brought home was identified by onlookers as a foreigner, probably German. A bystander described the man as a rough-looking laborer and detailed his attire in considerable detail. Police were unable to locate the man who was seen with Harriet that evening, even though a number of witnesses came forward in the case. In addition to reviewing all of the 27-year-old's communications, they also conducted conversations with everyone she had contact with in the years prior to the murder as well as at the time of the murder. The government offered a £200 prize for information leading to an arrest and conviction, but no leads were successfully produced by this incentive. It's unclear if the knife that police thought to be the murder weapon was ever verified, although at some time during the preliminary inquiry, they discovered one. The police also received letters revealing Ryder's suspicions about dubious foreigners from all around Europe while the probe was ongoing. Even though a lot of these leads were pursued, none of them were successful. The case of Harriet was called the Great Coram Street Murder by the media. Then, on January 18, 1973, someone was taken into custody. Utilizing the testimonies of the greengrocer who had served Harriet and her companion on the night of her murder, as well as the waiter who had previously served her at the theater, investigators located a clergyman named Henry James Bernard Hessel, who was en route to South America along with a group of German immigrants. Both witnesses were able to positively identify the doctor as the man who had been seen with Harriet on Christmas Eve. According to reports, the doctor had arrived in London the night of the crime after his ship had halted in Ramsgate, Kent, for repairs. His defense attorney contended in court that Dr. Hessel was unwell in bed, citing the fact that his boots had been left outside his door the entire night and that other witnesses could attest to his account. The populace felt differently, even if the authorities thought this might be their man. Dr. Hessel was a married, well-educated, and soft-spoken preacher, all characteristics that people thought made him a deserving part of their community. The public's perceptions remained unchanged, not even when, a few days after the murder, a maid came forward to say as much. She had been given 3 bloody handkerchiefs by Dr. Hessel's wife to wash, one of which was nearly completely drenched in blood. The maid also mentioned that the doctor had asked for turpentine and a clothes brush the day he returned from London. He did fight in court, but it was only because he had painted his wife's clothes by mistake. In the end, the magistrate released Dr. Hessel, who was adamant about his innocence and moral integrity. The doctor was a ship's chaplain, as it has come to light in more recent decades, when his flock expelled him due to alcoholism and mounting debt. Despite the fact that none of this turned him into a murderer, it undoubtedly damaged his reputation as a respectable citizen. It appears likely that he would have faced far greater scrutiny if this information had been known in the 1870s. Her brother claimed Harriet's body and buried it, though no one knows for sure. Additionally, it's unclear what happened to her 8-year-old daughter. Authorities made vain attempts in the years that followed Dr. Hessel's release to solve the case and achieve closure. The murder of Harriet is still unsolved because the case was never closed. Moving on to the next case. Beth Barard. When 2 men broke into a young woman's home early on September 23, 1986, thinking they would check on her, they were shocked by what they found. With a slit throat and a blanket covering her entire body, 23-year-old Beth Barnard was found lying on her bed. The men, who happened to be Beth's lover's family, left the area after informing the authorities of their findings. When investigators arrived on the scene shortly after, they were unprepared for the scene of blood bathing they found inside Beth's parents' home, which was situated on Phillip Island off the southern coast of Australia. They discovered knife fragments and cigarette butts at the scene, which were later determined to be unrelated to the injuries she had sustained. There were blood-stained paper towels by the bathroom sink. The authorities discovered that Beth's body had been repeatedly stabbed and sliced brutally and viciously, and that her nightgown had been shoved up to her neck beneath the blanket that had been placed over the body. Her clothes had odd double rips on them. She had defensive cuts on her wrists and arms. But the most terrifying injury was a big letter that was sliced into her chest. This particular detail led to Beth's murder being named the Scarlet Letter Murder because it is thought that the carved-in alludes to Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1850 novel of the same name, in which the main character gives birth to a child she conceived through an affair and is consequently made to wear a scarlet A on her dress. But first, we need to learn more about Beth's personal life in order to fully comprehend this purported allusion. When Beth was 21 years old, she met Fergus Cameron, 34, who owned a prosperous farm and was a founding shareholder of the prestigious Phillip Island Grand Prix. Following his meeting with Vivian in the 1970s, Fergus moved to the island with her, and they were married. Beth didn't experience this problem after relocating to the neighborhood. Unlike Vivian, who apparently had trouble fitting in, she was never perceived as an outsider because she was well-liked and well-known. Beth fit right in with the Phillip Island community, which was small, close-knit, and suspicious of outsiders. She had several close friends living there. Fergus was a volunteer at the Penguin Parade on Phillip Island, where Beth was working. For months later, he extended an invitation to her to become a farmhand for him and his family. Beth agreed and, surprisingly, adapted to life with the Camerons with ease. She was called a sister by Fergus's brother Donald's kids, and Beth and Fergus were having an affair by May of 1985. Vivian, who had witnessed her father abandon her mother in favor of a younger lady, was aware of Fergus's prolonged late-night phone calls and frequent absences. For the sake of their two young sons, she sought to strengthen their relationship out of fear that the same thing might happen again, but she could feel Fergus gradually losing interest. Beth's affair with one of the wealthiest and most powerful people on the island was well known at the time of her murder in the fall of 1986. So, when the 23-year-old's body was discovered with the letter A carved on it, the neighborhood and the police both had a good suspicion as to who might have committed the horrific murder. Fergus claims that his wife eventually confronted him about the affair on the evening of the 22nd, the night before the murder. Fergus, who is now 36, acknowledged that the pair had arguments. Vivian shattered a wine glass over his head and back in a fit of wrath, cutting his ear in the process. Without delay, she took her spouse to the hospital to receive medical attention for his injuries. The couple appeared to be together rather than aloof or chilly, according to hospital medical staff. But when questioned about what transpired, they did come across as a little reticent. Staff were informed about Fergus's fall through a glass door after they had suspicions about a marital conflict. Fergus then went to his sister Marnie's house and stayed the night. At 1 a.m, this is how Vivian last saw him. Fergus reported to the investigators that he was granted custody of the children in the event that his wife decided to return to Melbourne, ending their marriage. It's unknown what Vivian did that night, but around 3 a.m, she called her friend Robin to ask her to watch the kids because she had to go to the hospital. Although we are positive the pair visited the hospital much earlier that evening, she claims in several publications that she had to accompany her husband there. When the couple awoke the following morning, Vivian was still absent, and their Toyota Land Cruiser was gone. Robin was the one who initially informed Donald about this, pointing out that neither Fergus nor his wife had arrived to pick up the kids and that she had to leave for work. But after learning this, Fergus dispatched Donald and his family, along with Marnie's husband, Ian, to see how Beth was doing instead of asking them to look for Vivian. Donald stated that Beth was not dead, but rather that she was not well, when they reported the body to the police. To paraphrase the detectives working the case, they later stated that they thought Donald had been quite odd. It's the most composed, cool-headed group of people I've ever seen, Senior Constable Alan McFadden stated. You would believe these guys found bodies on a daily basis. Even so, no one was trying to find Vivian. A neighbor last saw her Land Cruiser at roughly 12:30 a.m. outside Beth's house. It was spotted again around 5 a.m. close to the San Remo Bridge. Later that day, at 4 p.m., authorities found it here, unlocked, with the windows down and the keys in the ignition. Contrary to expectations, the detectives found virtually little blood within. They also found a hunting knife, a bloody washcloth, and Vivian's handbag. It was determined at an inquest held 2 years later that Vivian most likely killed Beth in a self-destructive attack before taking her own life. Some investigators, however, believe that this notion was not supported by the important data they possessed. It's interesting to note that bloodstains on a towel in Beth's restroom matched Vivian, rather than the 23-year-old. Additionally, Vivian's blood was found in her own home. Robin, who visited the house in the middle of the night to look after the kids, said that when she arrived, there was no sign of Fergus, Vivian, or the broken wine glass, only her handbag, which was later discovered in the Land Cruiser, left behind. Marnie also mentioned that there were indications of conflict in the house when she had arrived to watch the kids while Vivian drove Fergus to the hospital. Blood was on tissues, the kitchen bench, the bed in the spare room, and the clothes in the washing hamper. Later on, it was discovered to match Vivian's. Moreover, Vivian's DNA was absent from Beth's body vicinity, even though it was discovered on the kitchen knife at the scene. Her DNA was only found in several cigarette butts and the bloodied tower, according to some accounts. When a teacher named Petritis turned into an author and wrote a book about the case, she discovered that the locals were either afraid of the police or unwilling to question them. When the book was published, one of the island's largest bookstores declined to carry it. Some found the residents' actions odd and even suspicious, while others saw it as the reaction of a small, close-knit community unwilling to focus on such a brutal and violent crime. After consulting with Vivian's acquaintances and other residents of the island, Vicky concluded that the young lady's suicide was uncharacteristic. It was said by many who knew her that Vivian would never abandon her kids. Notably, Vivian's friend Glenda Frost stated that the mother of two called her at 10 a.m. on September 23, 1986, a few hours after the murder. According to Glenda, the two talked about commonplace subjects like sewing patterns. If this is accurate, it indicates that Vivian did not commit suicide right away after the crime. Nonetheless, Glenda's testimony has been disregarded by the investigators, who maintain that she has been a model for their dates. Since there is absolutely no proof that Vivian is dead at all, criminal experts, including former law enforcement officers, have stated that they do not think she staged her death. As for Vivian, criminologist Catherine Whiteley, who focuses on women who kill, has openly expressed her disbelief, pointing out that it was a very, quote, male attack on Beth. Although women who commit murder tend to prefer more covert techniques like poisoning, suffocation, or drowning, this does not exclude them from being capable of this kind of intense brutality. Dr. Forensic Pathologist Sarah Yule disputes Catherine's assertion that the incident was the result of someone seeking retribution or acting in a fit of rage. The ferocity of it, she continues, shows the emotionality behind it, which further implies that the victim knows them. In his remarks, former investigator Rory O'Connor described the attack as brutal and frantic. There aren't many well-known people outside the Cameron family who might be connected to the case. Beth allegedly had a fan who was a Land Cruiser driver. It was reported that this individual would sit outside her home at night and would even start mowing her lawn while she was out at work. She apparently got into an argument with this person and told them to change their behavior. Beth said to friends that a few days later he got upset with me. Furthermore, a college student who attended the Penguin March harbored affections for the 23-year-old but failed to reciprocate them. It's unclear, though, if these two individuals have now been looked into and ruled out. In a statement, another neighbor of Beth's claimed that the night of the crime, at 7:50 p.m., a car pulled into her driveway, sat there, and then turned off its lights. Fergus did not finish work until 8 o'clock at night, so it's unclear what happened to this lead, but it looks like he's in the clear. There aren't many more explanations regarding Beth's situation. The majority of people either think that Fergus was the one who killed both Beth and his wife, or they think that the police had the right explanation. Beth allegedly felt uneasy about the romance and was planning to give Fergus an ultimatum. According to some, the 36-year-old killed his sweetheart in retaliation for her ultimatum, but she struck back, hurting him, and a bloody struggle ensued. After cleaning himself off and setting up the crime scene, Fergus claimed to have wounds, which he explained to Vivian by saying that he had broken up with Beth and that she had assaulted him in vengeance. Together, they went to the hospital and concocted a tale about his wounds. Fergus and his family wrote a story during this period that they intended to tell the police. When Vivian got home the next morning, it's possible that's when she contacted Glenda. Fergus then joined her and killed her. It's possible that the police neglected to look into the Camerons' farm immediately after learning of Beth's death and the Land Cruiser's reappearance, which gave them time to dispose of Vivian's body. But for the time being, all of this is conjecture. The Victorian police report that the case is still ongoing. Moving on to the next case. Amy Bilig. Amy Bilig, a 17-year-old girl with creativity and vibrancy, loved to read, write poems, play the flute and guitar, and be a proud activist for animal rights. By all accounts, she was well-liked and well-known. Thus, her disappearance from Miami, Florida in 1974 was unexpected and especially tragic. On March 5, 1974, a Tuesday, Amy was going out with her friends. But first, she needed money, so she drove down the main highway in her Coconut Grove neighborhood, looking for a ride to her father's job at an art gallery, where she planned to beg for a small loan of money. Amy felt safe in the neighborhood, despite the fact that most of us these days knew better than to hitchhike alone. Even though she could have walked to the gallery, she had previously taken several rides. Because of this, she was accustomed to it and had no reason to worry that this trip would be any different from the dozens of others she had taken. Unfortunately, though, things would be very different this time. Amy never made it to her father Ned Bialik's office. She also failed to show up for the later that day meeting with her friends. Amy had not been seen and had not been contacted by anyone. Authorities were promptly notified by her parents, and the situation of the missing youngster was investigated. The Bilig family was contacted early on in the original investigation by someone they believed to be Amy's kidnapper. The offender demanded $30,000 over the phone in exchange for the 17-year-old's safe return. However, the caller turned out to be two 16-year-old boys, Charles and Larry Glasser, who were identified by the authorities. They were shady characters with no connection to the case and no knowledge of Amy's location. Regretfully, they squandered valuable time and funds that could have been used more effectively. In the end, they were accused of extortion. Amy's mother, Susan Bilig, carried out her own comprehensive investigation, following up on leads and tips wherever she could, while the police kept searching for clues. Her investigation took her across the nation. In an effort to find her lost daughter, she even crossed the Atlantic to visit the United Kingdom. One of the tips that Susan and the police got was that Amy had been kidnapped by one of the two biker gangs who were passing through the area at the time. One group was referred to as the Pagans and the other as the Outlaws. Both gangs are mentioned in sources relevant to Amy's case. While Pagans received most of the attention, both were dangerous, trafficking in weapons, drugs, and prostitutes. Susan seized the opportunity to pursue this possible lead and frantically looked for her child. A family acquaintance who had assisted the Pagans with some legal work was able to arrange a meeting for Susan, Ned, and two group members. During this meeting, the couple discovered that although these specific members had not seen their daughter, it was common for gang members to purchase, trade, and exchange young ladies who had been abducted for cash or material items like brand new bikes. The members promised the Bilings that they would investigate Amy's disappearance by speaking with people who knew her, but they were never able to locate any further details. If they did, they never disclosed it to the family. Susan located the bikers in Orlando, Florida, 3 months after they vanished. Here, a manager at a convenience store said he identified Amy as a girl who had been with the group. She had visited the store multiple times to purchase vegetable soup because she was a vegetarian, and she was last spotted with at least 2 gang members. Sadly, this had no positive outcome, although offering the family and the police some hope. Not until January 1976, a year and a half later, when a man named Dave called Susan and confessed that he used to, quote, own her daughter were any new leads pursued. Though he had accepted to have a conversation at his home, he appeared anxious when the mother arrived, as though she had been followed. He recognized this as the girl he once owned when he looked at Amy's picture. He saw her scar from the appendectomy, which had not been disclosed to the public at the time, and characterized her as being incredibly quiet, almost like a mute. Dave consented to investigate Amy's location, and a few weeks later, he and Susan went to Oklahoma, the state where the adolescent was allegedly being detained. When they got to the tavern in June, where Amy was intended to be handed to the couple, a fight broke out and injured Dave. Several more motorcycles picked Susan up and took her somewhere safe. Although Dave eventually informed her lawyer that Amy was probably in Seattle, she never saw him again. Susan, who had just suffered a heart attack, went to Seattle in November of 1977. She made multiple witnesses swear they had seen Amy by going around showing the picture of her daughter to patrons and staff in bars, clubs, tattoo parlors, and motorcycle stores. Again and again, people compared her to a mute. A few years later, in the winter of 1979, Susan received a call from an unidentified male who said that Amy was in need of assistance and was at a truck stop outside of Reno, Nevada. The FBI was able to verify that the biker gang traveled through that area, but they were unable to verify if the young lady was among them. Only a single piece of evidence was found during the whole investigation. Amy's camera was on Florida's Turnpike, a toll road, at the Wildwood exit. It was discovered soon after the adolescent vanished and turned in by a man who had learned of her disappearance. The biker gang's route would have passed this exit as they headed north. Amy may or may not have had the camera on her when she vanished. It might have been misplaced earlier. Unfortunately, nothing significant was found on the camera. The majority of the processed images were overexposed, and one image only featured a white van, providing investigators with no further information. Paul Branch, a pagan, came forward in the late 1970s to inform Susan that Amy was his girlfriend and that he had lived with her for a while after buying her in Orlando. A year later, he claimed to have been arrested and had left Amy with his housemates. However, upon his release from prison, he discovered that they had both vanished, along with his motorcycle. Branch also told Susan at one point that her daughter was still alive and being held captive by other gang members. But Branch's wife said, following his death in the 1990s, that he had changed his mind on his deathbed and told her that Amy had gone to a pagan celebration the night before she vanished. She was allegedly raped after becoming ungracious and mouthy, but she fought back. She was so forced to take medications till her heart failed. It has been stated that her body was disposed of in the Florida Everglades. At first, this horrific narrative might appear plausible. However, it was eventually discovered that the widow had accepted payment from a documentary crew in exchange for telling her story. The crew filmed Susan and the widow getting to know one another. Because money was involved, the claim's veracity was called into question. The story is not believed by many police investigators or internet sleuths. It appears likely that the widow made this up in order to benefit financially that the family may have encountered while doing their research, in spite of all the confusion and red herrings. Amy's parents started getting odd, unsettling phone calls from an unidentified male caller soon after she vanished. He said that Amy was being held captive after being kidnapped by members of an illegal sex ring. He went into great detail about what was happening to her. The family endured 21 years of harassment from the caller before the FBI identified a man who used a mobile phone as the source of one of the calls in 1995. The caller had been using pay phones up until that moment, which had made it challenging to track him down and capture him. It was discovered that Henry Johnson Blair, a U.S. Customs Department employee, was the deranged person who had been bringing the family grief for more than 20 years. His weak defense for the severe suffering he inflicted on the family, which he produced by his upsetting remarks, was that he was an alcoholic and suffered from OCD. Blair asserted that he didn't know Amy personally and didn't know anything about her disappearance. This claim was called into doubt, though, when law enforcement discovered specifics about a man who was mentioned in the teenager's journal. Amy wrote about Hank, a man who had offered her to travel to South America with him and with whom she was thinking of running away. Blair was reportedly known by the moniker Hank and had to move to South America for work. In addition, he had a vehicle that was identical to the one seen in the images taken from Amy's camera in terms of both color and model. Even with these strange coincidences, Blair's case was never proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Blair ultimately served just 2 years in prison for his 2 decades of harassment of the family. Susan also reached a $5,000,000 settlement in her lawsuit against him. The Bilig family's hopes were restored in 1992 when Susan received a call from a private investigator working on Amy's case. The investigator, a British national, said that he had been approached by an American biker who was trying to sell a young woman while he was in Falmouth, England. She was characterized as mute and was also American. Nevertheless, he failed to provide a photo, and the British investigator died a year later, making the lead useless. There are relatively few new leads and theories in Amy's case. The majority of internet detectives fall into one of 2 categories. Either Henry Johnson Blair is hiding something, or the biker gang knows something and is keeping it quiet. Many contend that it is improbable that so many individuals would be aware of the adolescent's fate and that no one would come forward. Some, however, believe the motorcyclists were just having fun while tormenting a bereaved family. However, some others think Blair was just a deranged person who enjoyed inflicting pain on Amy's family and had nothing to do with the case. Some, however, think that there is too much evidence to deny the plausible link between him, the van Amy took pictures of, and her journal. Amy's parents, however, will never see justice served for their missing child. After a fight with lung cancer, Ned lost away in the early 1990s, and Susan survived to be 80 years old before passing away in February 2005. Before she passed away, she co-wrote a book called Without a Trace, The Disappearance of Amy Bilig, A Mother's Search for Justice, which was about her daughter's disappearance. Amy's case was also highlighted on America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. Sadly, there is still no explanation for her disappearance. Amy would be 63 years old if she were still living. She may have gone by the aliases Mellow Cheryl, Sunshine, Mute, and Little Pieces when she was a member of the biker gang.